Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review. And in this video I'm going to review MELINOE by Akhlys. This is the third full-length album of Akhlys and the second one that they have in DEBEMUR MORTI Productions. The first one was a dark ambient album that it's better to pretend that it never happened. The second one, The Dreaming Eye, was the one album that put them into the spot and was their debut in DEBEMUR MORTI Productions. And it was a really nice tight combination of atmospheric black metal with dark ambient elements with some quite lengthy and really atmospheric and dark tracks. It was raw, intense, with excellent performances and some quite nice intense drumming and pretty imaginative riffs. It got highly praised, and I wouldn't go this far in order to say that this is one of the greatest atmospheric black metal albums to have been done in recent memory. I can still say though that it's a pretty decent project and a really nice modern black metal album. So I obviously was kind of excited to listen to their next album and see how further they're going to go with their sound. And DEBEMUR MORTI Productions is one of my favorite current labels when it comes to black metal. From a big portion of the stuff they have, they're definitely one of the most intriguing, eccentric and unique black metal labels out there, just being a bit more cutting edge and going with some of the artists they have into some different and more refreshing directions of black metal. Akhlys do not really fit into this spectrum. For the most part, we're talking about a more straightforward and standard approach on atmospheric black metal, but it's the whole dark atmosphere that truly make some of their material stand out. Now this album was actually meant to be released in December, but the album got leaked and they ended up releasing it sooner in platforms like Bandcamp and YouTube, which is something that was the case with the latest album from Bluetooth Nord the previous year. What you get with the latest Akhlys record is pretty much what you would expect. You have only 5 tracks which are extremely lengthy, that have some dark ambient introductions or finishers, and for the most part the rest of it is pretty much standard atmospheric black metal. Now what I would say it's a big improvement in this album compared to The Dreaming Eye is the production. The sound of this thing is superb. The Dreaming Eye definitely had an interesting raw feel to it, but this one, even if it's a bit more clear, it just sounds so well detailed. The instrumentation in the atmospheric passages over here sound extremely dark and beautiful, and production wise and performance wise this album is top notch. But this by itself doesn't really say all that much if the ideas presented on this album are not really that much worth it. And I would say that unfortunately this new album of Akhlys suffers from just that. The ideas over here are just so standard and generic black metal stuff. When I first heard of the track that was teased towards the release of this album, Pnigalion, I was extremely disappointed with the result. We're talking about the longest track in this album, which goes for almost 13 minutes, and it's one of those occasions where I don't feel that this track really manages to be all that captivating in its entire runtime. It's one of those tracks that feels extremely bloated and not worth going for almost 13 minutes long. This was a painfully boring track with the entire structure of it just feeling so basic and so standard. Pnigalion is such a safe, atmospheric black metal track. It's extremely generic, and it's not like their previous album, The Dreaming Eye, was that much of a mind-blowing and different direction of atmospheric black metal, but I at least found that some of the ideas presented on this album had an interesting sense to them, something memorable, which is something that completely misses over here. This track was extremely forgettable. Now what I would say is that listening to it more and more and with the context of the rest of the album, I do have to say that there are at least two riffs over here that are really good. There are two riffs that I really enjoyed, but we're talking about the 12-minute track, so obviously just two riffs is not enough, and in its vast majority this track does not deliver, as it has some extremely monotonous and forgettable passages for the most part. Fortunately, I would say that the album somewhat picks up with the very first track, Somniloquy. The dark ambient passage at the beginning was nothing that special, but we immediately get into a much more well-crafted track, and I think that this track kicks things off with one of the greatest riffs out of this whole project. I really love the atmosphere out of the very first riff of this thing, and I also like the drumming and the structure of this thing. It somewhat goes into a more slightly avant-garde direction, and I really enjoy it. The track as we move forward doesn't really justify itself for its 8.5 minute runtime, as I do find that as we get further into the song, it has some moments that don't really manage to stick as much, but the ending result is definitely more captivating and not as generic compared to the teaser track, which was also unnecessarily lengthy. So, having mixed thoughts about two of the tracks, it was up to the rest of the track listing to see how much this album was going to live up to the expectations, but unfortunately it was just going downhill from here. The track Succuber was just such a weak dark ambient track. Like, this track does not have a single atmospheric black metal element to it. It's just 6 minutes of dark ambient, which is not something that I have an issue with, but in this particular case it was extremely underdeveloped, and it possibly makes for the worst moment out of this whole project, because there is really nothing about it. It sounds so uninteresting, so shallow, so flat. Nothing is intriguing about it. It mostly sounds like some background noise. There is little to nothing about it. It's just with the last moment where the track finally picks up and ends up having a melodic passage to it, which this simple melodic passage could easily make for an interesting dark ambient and dungeon synth approach, but it never comes, as it ends really quickly and leads to absolutely nothing. So with this context it feels really unnecessary. It would be just so much better in my opinion if this melodic passage was the main focus in the entirety of this track, and just developing more sounds from this point as the track goes on. But unfortunately this is not the case, and we're left with such an unimaginative and weak dark ambient track. The fourth track, Ephialtes, goes back into the atmospheric black metal roots, and it's a track that in its production and its performance is really cool, but in its 8.5 minute runtime there is not a single riff out of this thing that managed to click with me, or just something memorable about it. It was such a forgettable track. There was really nothing special about it. It was such a painfully generic track with really weak structure to it. This track was also extremely disappointing. I feel that this album saves the best for last with the track Incubation, and even this track in its 10-minute runtime, it's not like that much of an amazing track from start to finish. Like, it has this really slow introduction with this dark ambient passage that it's not really that special, and it goes for almost 2 minutes. But it really manages to pick up and kick things off with one of the greatest riffs out of this whole project. The very first riff out of this thing is simply amazing. I love the whole performance with the blast beats on this thing. It just sounds furious. I really love its dark atmosphere. It just sounds so beautiful, and I would hope for this riff to be repeated more in this track, but we still have some pretty intriguing moments over here. The elements of structure over here feel slightly better. There are some more memorable riffs over there, and it's possibly the best track in terms of sound and performance. But yeah, there's not really much more other than that. So this album, compared to The Dreaming Guy that was made 5 years ago, it's definitely a big disappointment. Even if there is a massive improvement in terms of performance and production, it doesn't really matter if the ideas are not there. And unfortunately, this album lacks atmosphere. It feels flat and almost pointless. Unfortunately, for the most part, it just sounds like another typical atmospheric black metal album. And I do still believe that Akhlys is a band that has potential and that can do some really great stuff in the future. But for me at least, this is not an album that can manage to prove this. I'm going to give Melinoë a 6- out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.